Hello, and welcome to today's live reading of Vampires of Atlantis by Courtney Davis, presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Ian hated leaving the water. His home and purpose in life were death, depending on how you wanted to look at it. He was a vampire of Atlantis, a city sunken to contain monsters that had once threatened the lives of all the land. The horrible beasts that preyed on humans without thought or mercy. Vampires may have sipped from the humans, but it wasn't thoughtless. And it wasn't violent. The vampires were royalty. They were the chosen ones. They were the protectors, the warriors. And in return, they were given blood offerings. It was a small price to pay for the humans to pay for their safety. The city was sunk into what was now called the Bermuda Triangle. And for 12,000 years, the vampires had done their job perfectly, despite being betrayed and forgotten by the humans. And for the last 500 years, Ian had been in charge. Nothing had gone wrong, until now. Last night, Norgis had escaped. How the bastard had gotten out, Ian had no idea, but it was his responsibility to go above the waterline, find the monster, and return him. It had probably been 1,000 years since he'd set foot on land above the waterline, but he knew what to expect. They'd kept a close watch on the world above, updating their knowledge of customs and vocabulary for a scenario just like this. He resented the duty, though. He would have preferred to send one of his trusted men, except this had never happened before. No monster had escaped in all these years, so he had to take care of it personally. It wasn't even the monster hunting that he begrudged. He actually looked forward to stretching his abilities once more and taking down the dumb beast. It was the possible run-in with the Aristotle Society that he wasn't looking forward to. The last time he'd been out of the water, he'd had a nasty encounter with them. Human bastards who thought they were special just because they were privy to the existence of Atlantis. They were more of a danger to humans with their little pets than vampires ever were. Ian hoped to avoid them this time. His hand absently rubbed at the bite scar on his left arm. He wouldn't have time to stop and deal with them when there was a monster to contain. The moon was high, and he took a moment to appreciate the sight of it. It should have been fully dark when he emerged, but garish glaring lights were visible not far away, and their brightness invaded the deserted beach. Ian stripped the wetness from his shoulder-length blonde locks as he looked at his surroundings with disdain. From where he stood, he could see a few people moving about on the other side of the beach, could smell their warm blood. His fangs descended. It had been a while since a ship full of warm bodies had been taken to eat. During the last 100 years, he'd ordered the inhabitants of Atlantis to satiate themselves with large sea animals that hunters returned with. It was necessary in order to keep their secrets safe as human technology had advanced. Blood was blood. It did the job. But there was something special about taking it from the warm neck of a human. Ian supposed it reminded them of what it had been like when they were rewarded for their position of protection. When they'd accepted this life as guardians in the deep, it had been a thing of celebration, of offerings and bounty. Ian brought his hunger under control and strode across the beach toward the light and noise. A group of young men stopped to stare from a nearby walkway. "Yo, dude, what movie set did you just crawl out of?" One laughed. "Yeah, you look like you belong on stage shaking your dick for cash," another yelled and slapped his friend's back. Ian grasped the sword that hung at his side and fisted his other hand. It was tempting to slit the throats of these idiots for thinking they could talk to him in such a manner. But he knew humans had forgotten him, forgotten what he was and how the vampires protected them from horrific death. He forced his body to calm. This wasn't a battle arena, and they weren't a threat, just dumb. "What city is this?" he demanded. "Miami, man. What's your deal? You follow a cruise ship or something?" the first one called. "Miami," Ian said slowly, testing the word on his tongue. He'd heard of this city. They tried to keep track of the changes above the waterline, and this place, being so close to the entrance of Atlantis, had come up more than once. This is where the St. Norgis had led him. And that meant it was no longer a safe place for humans. "Miami is in trouble, young men. I suggest you gather your weapons and protect your women." Ian strode forward. The scent of Norgis was faint and tainted. There were far too many strange smells up here distorting the trail, but he could still follow it. Where do you keep your ancient items of power? Ian demanded. The group looked at him with blank stares, and Ian wondered if these were simpletons. Where do you go to learn of your past and protect your future? Ian prodded. More blank stares. School? One said without confidence. Ian grunted and decided they were not going to be able to help him. He continued past, heading toward the wall of noise just beyond the trees. Dude's got a fucking sword, one of the young men said as Ian strode past. Probably drunk, another said with a laugh. The trees offered him cover and a moment to gather himself in shadows. He stood there hidden and watched, allowing himself to feel overwhelmed for a moment. The world was nothing like he remembered. It was bright as day there beyond the trees, and his green eyes, so used to the low lights of Atlantis, squinted against it as they tried to adjust. The sounds of so many people, music, and fast-moving vehicles assaulted his ears. He thought he must have made a mistake. He was not the one to do so. He should have sent someone else, someone who had more recently been above the waterline. This was not a world he knew anything about anymore. How could he keep himself hidden? How could he find Norgus? How could he do either of those things without killing every irritating, blood-filled human that crossed his path? Even as he thought it, a female dressed in tight fabric that barely covered her body approached and leaned against a tree, pushing her chest out to him. Hey, baby, is there something I can do for you? You look like Tarzan just crawled out of the ocean to play, she drawled. Her breath was thick with sickness. No doubt her body was not long for this world. He didn't hold back his scowl at her, interrupting him. You can offer me nothing, female. Go about your business and find a healer before it's too late. You are my business. I'll do you a handy for $10, big fella. She reached for his sealskin leather kilt, but he batted her hand away easily. His belt held his sword and a few other items he thought he might need, including gold coins. Ian pulled out one of the coins, realizing this female was a prostitute. He threw it at her feet and walked away. Idiots and whores, he said under his breath. No wonder Norgus chose to come here. They will be easy to subjugate, even for him. Ian moved along, following the hint of Norgus's stench, sticking mostly to shadows and watching the humans curiously. These men wore more clothing than he did, but many of the women wore less. Bits of cloth that only covered their sex and breasts. Could they all be whores? Perhaps he'd just come out into the part of town where the sexual tempters flourished at night. This would not be the place he would find Norgus, who he assumed was after something magical to aid in whatever plan he'd managed to come up with, or someone had come up with for him. Ian frowned as his mind circled around the idea that Norgus had been helped, had been released rather than escaped. Norgus was not the smartest monster in the prison, and Ian doubted he'd be able to come up with any plan on his own. That was a more worrying thought. If Norgus had help, that meant someone had betrayed Ian. The second time Ian was approached by a lone female offering her body for pay. He didn't smell sickness on her. Knowing he'd need the strength to concentrate on his task, he pulled her into his arms, and to the shadow of the building, she moaned a practiced sound that he didn't for a moment believe, and he rolled his eyes as his fangs extended. He forced her head to the side, exposing her soft neck. He could smell her blood pumping steadily just under the surface. She wasn't afraid, but she should be. His head dipped, anticipation high, as he thought of taking the sweet blood of a warm human into his mouth once again. He froze, millimeters from piercing her flesh. A scent drifted to him and stilled his body. Every one of his cells rippled with a strange electricity. He dropped the female he'd been holding and a gold coin for her trouble, ignoring her grunts of outrage. Unable to ignore the scent, he stalked through a dark alley and across the street, hiding in shadow. His eyes sought out the one whose blood had awakened something deep within him, had lit a fire that even now was burning through him with an intensity he'd never experienced. He didn't at first understand, but when his eyes landed on her, his heart stopped, and he knew. His instincts raged at him to move, to grab her and run, to claim her before anyone else could. The only thing stopping him, she wasn't alone, and he knew enough of this modern world to hesitate, to watch and wait. Females didn't take kindly to being stolen away. He studied her from a distance, drinking in every inch of her he could see. Hair as black as night that reached almost to her waist, and a slight body wrapped tightly in a white dress that showed a lot of long hand, leg, and bare arms. He ached to touch that skin, to smell it and taste it. He envied everyone who was closer to her. everyone that was able to see or smell her better than he could. When she turned, her eyes scanning curiously into the darkness where he'd slunk, he could tell they were eyes as blue as the ocean in her perfectly round face with pink lips and sharp eyebrows. He wanted her to see him, wanted to watch recognition form in her eyes, recognition that he was the last male she'd ever need or want. He was destined to have her as his own, and she had to be feeling it too. Catherine hated dates. Group or not, this was torture. Her favorite coworker, Jenny, had begged her to double date. Her boyfriend, Max's cousin, was in town and wanted to see the Miami nightlife. Catherine had only agreed because Jenny was such a good friend, and even more so because she had laughed at a joke when she didn't know Catherine could hear about the cobwebs that must be between Catherine's legs. Catherine knew she needed to get back out in the dating world. Her near marriage had ended over 2 years ago, but she just wasn't interested in dating another idiot who would take her money and her dog and leave her with non-refundable wedding deposits. She knew that was a very specific scenario that would probably not occur again, especially since she didn't currently own a dog, but still, why risk it? She had a good job at the museum. She liked to read and she liked to be alone. It was a safe life, maybe a little boring, but safe. Jenny was fun, and it showed in her short black hair and spunky style. She was filled with a joy for life and an energy she must have been born with. Her good mood always rubbed off on Catherine, which was one reason she gravitated toward Jenny for friendship. Catherine knew she needed someone to lift her up out of her dumped funk, and Jenny had been the person for the last 6 months. Tonight was the first time she'd actually let Jenny convince her to get out on a sort of date, though. Catherine had to admit it was probably time, but tonight's company wasn't exactly her type. So here she was with Jenny and Max in the blind date, Tony, at a crowded bar near the beach. It wasn't terrible as far as the night out went. Tony was nice and didn't try to make her feel too much like a date. He was from out of town and dressed like a tourist in tan cargo shorts and a flamboyant shirt. She never would have picked him for a date if she'd seen him in the bar or club. He seemed to sense her hesitation and only got close when it looked like another guy was going to approach. She appreciated that. They were standing outside of the club debating on hitting another or calling it a night when she felt a strange sensation. A feeling of being watched. There were people everywhere, of course, and she darted her gaze around, not noticing anyone in particular looking her way. She shivered as the feeling intensified, a chill running through her despite the warm Florida night. "Are you cold?" Tony asked, reaching out and rubbing her arms briskly. A sound reached her ears then, something unrecognizable, something animalistic. She turned her head again, eyes scanning for danger. She saw nothing, but expected to be attacked by a panther at any second. "Oh no, are you ill?" Jenny asked with concern. "Oh my God, did you get roofied?" A look of horror passed over Tony's face at the suggestion. He was a nice guy. "No, I don't think so. I just think I might be coming down with something. Perhaps I should call it a night." It was a perfect excuse to end this evening of pretend dating. "I'll just grab a cab. You guys go on to the next club and have fun." "Are you sure? I could see that you get home safe," Tony offered gallantly. No, thanks though. I really don't feel well and I don't want to ruin everyone's night." She gave him a weak smile of apology. "My stomach is bad, probably from the clams in there. I'll see you tomorrow, Jenny. I hope you have a great rest of your vacation, Tony." Catherine held out a hand for a cab. "I'm sure you're okay to get home," Jenny said with a sigh, not at all believing that Catherine was sick. "I'm fine," Catherine assured her. "I'm a big girl." "You're 5 foot tall and 100 pounds. You could get taken out by a strong wind," Jenny laughed and gave Catherine a tight hug. "Thanks for coming in," she whispered in her ear. "You lasted longer than I expected." "Rude," Catherine laughed, pulling away. "See you tomorrow." A cab had stopped and Catherine hopped in, breathing a sigh of relief after she gave her address and it pulled away from the curb. "Bad date?" the driver asked with a quick glance over his shoulder. "Wasn't really a date, but aren't they all bad?" she said with a laugh. "Only if you've given up on love." Catherine gave the back of the man's head a frown. He had gray hair and wrinkled skin. He was wearing a button-up shirt, and the cab smelled surprisingly clean. If she had to guess, he was a retired grandpa doing this to keep himself busy. Maybe his wife had died, and he had just had to get out, get some social interaction. He'd found love in a time when people married at 18 and didn't divorce, no matter what. Nowadays, with divorce almost a certainty, her broken engagement was probably a blessing. It could have been worse. Kids could have been involved. But had she given up on love? She didn't feel very hopeful of it, that's for sure. Healthy skepticism is what she'd been telling herself, but maybe it was something more. Maybe something had broken when Steve had left her. She suddenly felt very alone and couldn't wait to sit down with one of her fantasy romance novels. Spending time with fictional man with superhuman abilities, who couldn't hurt her like Steve had seemed like a much better use of her time.